Thanks for joining us. I'm Amarachi Ubani. We begin with the United States rejecting a UN Security Council draft resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. The resolution received 13 votes, with the US being the sole country which voted against the Algerian draft resolution, arguing it would jeopardize ongoing talks to end the war. Britain was the only country that abstained from voting.
The primary custodian of international peace and security, the Security Council cannot afford passivity in face of the call for a ceasefire in Gaza. By presenting this text, our intention is to empower the Council to fulfill its mandate and protect lives. Every Palestinian is a target for death, extermination, and genocide. We should ask ourselves how many innocent lives must be sacrificed before the Council deems it necessary to call for a ceasefire.
The United States is working on a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas, along with Egypt and Qatar. This hostage deal would bring an immediate and sustained period of calm to Gaza for at least 6 weeks, and from there, we could take the time to build a more enduring peace. Any action this Council takes right now should help, not hinder, these sensitive and ongoing negotiations. And we believe that the resolution on the table right now would, in fact, negatively impact those negotiations. Demanding an immediate, unconditional ceasefire without an agreement requiring Hamas to release the hostages will not bring about a durable peace.
The veto of this draft resolution is not only regrettable after weeks of consultations with every single council member, and after endless patience by the State of Palestine, the Arab states, and nearly the entire international community that for months have demanded a ceasefire. It is absolutely reckless and dangerous against shielding Israel, even as it commits the most shocking crimes.
This Council must put politics aside for the sake of its mandate. A ceasefire that allows Hamas to remain in power means ensured death and destruction. Ignoring Hamas's atrocities and not condemning them means empowering terrorists worldwide. And focusing only on Gaza while looking away from the terror aggression across the region will lead to a future that none of us seek. The Security Council must fulfill its mandate. It must side with Israel against the forces of evil, and it must face reality.
Meanwhile, U.S. actions at the Security Council have received widespread criticism. China says the move sent the wrong message and effectively gave a green light to the continued slaughter. Beijing's ambassador to the United Nations, Zhang Jun, expressed strong disappointment and dissatisfaction with the U.S., noting that the motion would interfere with ongoing diplomatic negotiations. Russia's ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, says a U.S. veto marked another black page in the history of the Security Council. He accused the U.S. of trying to play for time so that Israel could complete its inhumane plans for Gaza, namely to squeeze the Palestinians out of the territory and completely cleanse the enclave. France, on the other hand, expressed regret that the resolution could not be adopted given the disastrous situation in Gaza. The U.S. had proposed its own temporary ceasefire resolution, which also warned Israel not to invade the southern city of Rafah, but many say its recent action is a blow to U.S. President Joe Biden. Joe Biden himself says his administration bears direct responsibility for derailing the resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza, adding that it benefits the agenda of the Israeli occupation, which aims to kill and displace Palestinians. And we'll be returning to this in a moment, but the World Food Programme has paused its aid deliveries to northern Gaza. Officials say Israeli gunfire as well as complete chaos, has hindered its humanitarian operation in the area. The latest suspension increases fears of starvation in northern Gaza, which has been almost completely cut off from aid since last October amid Israel's devastating war on the enclave. The WFP says the decision has not been taken lightly as it risks people dying of hunger. It said the safety and security to deliver critical food aid and for people receiving it must be ensured. Last month, the agency suspended deliveries to the north after a strike hit an aid truck. It tried resuming deliveries this week, but said convoys faced gunfire and crowds of hungry people stripping goods and beating the driver. We're back now to our top story, which is the UN resolution in the Security Council. The VOA's UN correspondent, Margaret Bashir, joins us now. Margaret, it's great to see you after such a long time. Let's talk about what happened on Tuesday. The US vetoing that resolution demanding a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. It was supported by just 13 countries, UK abstaining. How was the US argument for this received by other members of the Security Council, although we do have some idea with the condemnations by other countries?
Thanks for having me back. I wouldn't say just 13 council members. There are only 15. So 13 is the overwhelming majority, and it would have been adopted if not for the U.S. veto. You only need 9 members to support a resolution in order for it to be adopted. But in light of the U.S. No vote, that was a veto. Look, council members, they want to see an end to the civilian suffering. They're very worried about this offensive that may be happening in the next few weeks in Rafah. There are more than 1.5 million Palestinians literally crammed into this small area in southern Gaza. It's, the conditions are just horrible. So there is frustration with the United States. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah, and help us understand exactly what the U.S., why the U.S. is against a ceasefire and why it rejected the deal by Algeria.
Right. So I wouldn't say the U.S. is against a ceasefire per se. You heard Linda Thomas Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador, in the clip that you showed. The United States does not want an unconditional ceasefire. That's their main concern. They say that if you give Hamas a ceasefire, which is what they want, then there's no incentive for them to release the hostages. And there's still more than 100, I think around 130 hostages being held by Hamas. So this is the U.S. Point, that there must be these negotiations on the ground that they're having in Cairo with the Egyptians, Qatar, and Israel. They are slow going, as diplomacy often is. They've been going on for weeks and weeks, but it's going to be hard to get a deal, and they don't want the council interfering and torpedoing the possibility for a deal.
Yeah, and just wondering whether, I'm sure that the Algerian proposal was widely received by members of the Security Council, given the fact that everyone seems to want to see an end to this ceasefire in Gaza, especially for the millions of people who are still there on the ground suffering, and looking at, what's been going on. But did anybody pay attention to what the Israeli ambassador said? The fact that Hamas might take advantage of a ceasefire to regroup, to once again prepare its onslaught against the Israeli Defense Forces, and then take advantage of having these people on the ground to create more chaos and even create more casualties, for the IDF forces.
Sure, a lot of council members have reaffirmed their belief that Israel has a right to self-defense. They don't question that. So sure, they accept that argument. But there's also a concern, not just from Security Council members, but from the UN Secretary General and senior UN officials, that Israel must take care to protect civilians, to protect civilian infrastructure, like hospitals and schools and bakeries and all these sorts of electrical power plants and such. In their war, it must be targeted. You can't attack a hospital if there are a lot of civilians in it. There are rules for war. So yes to both, really. Everybody understands arguments on both sides, but this is the Middle East. It's always been a complicated question, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and it's only getting more so right now.
Yes, and just again, the Palestinian ambassador to the UN says that more innocent lives will be destroyed if Israel's offensive is not stopped. Do other council members feel that the IDF is targeting innocent civilians? Because that's the narrative that's going around. Israel is killing innocent people in Gaza, but the IDF has said its target is Hamas militants, and they've said this over and over again.
Sure. I think it depends where your country is from, how you see this issue. There are different perspectives on it, of course. Look, the U.S. has expressed its concern to Israel, its closest ally in the region. And in fact, in this counterproposal that the United States has put forward, its own resolution it's proposing to the Council, it does call for a temporary ceasefire, but again, it would be in exchange for the release of hostages, all the hostages. But it also makes very clear that under the current circumstances, with 1.5 million civilians in Rafah, that a major military offensive there it should not happen. It is clearly spelled out in their proposed text. So even from Israel's friends, there are concerns about civilian safety.
Margaret, do you observe the kind of relations, the kind of conversations around the U.S. ambassador to the UN Security Council, to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the kinds of conversations that she has with the Israeli ambassador as well as the Palestinian ambassador? How does the U.S. navigate its relations with the two, despite supporting Israel with military aid?
Well, I have to say those conversations are private. They take place behind closed doors. They certainly do not take place in front of the press. But I'm sure it's a very delicate, sensitive dance with both countries, with both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And it's just
I can imagine
that happens up here.
Now, I'm not sure that this was discussed at the resolution meeting, but I know the UK's Prince of Wales wants to visit humanitarian organizations in Gaza. His visit will spotlight the difficulty of their work, in this war-prone zone, and draw attention to the suffering there. What sort of impact do you think that, his visit could have on the war and on future UN resolutions?
Well, that wasn't brought up at the meeting on Tuesday. I think that statement came out a little bit after it, actually. I don't think he said that he's planning to go to Gaza. I think for security reasons that would be impossible. But he did express concern about the urgent need for humanitarian aid to get through and for the hostages to be released. And I think his statement has captured some headlines because the British royal family is a constitutional monarchy. They don't usually comment publicly, even privately, on political issues, especially controversial ones, polarizing ones. But it's been a big issue in Britain. There have been a lot of protests in the street. So, Queen Elizabeth, she would never have, I don't think, said something publicly. So it's certainly gotten a lot of attention.
Yeah, it did get a lot of attention. It almost seemed like, a member of the royal family was getting entangled with the politics of what was going on, and that usually isn't, the norm. But speaking of the UN, and I know that they've come under lots of criticism about, their approach and their response to the war in Gaza. It seems a lot of talk goes on, at the Security Council. A lot of talking goes on. You have a lot of appeals from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and yet it seems the UN is handicapped when it comes to what's currently going on with Israel and with the Palestinians and with the war in Gaza.
So politically they are, because the Secretary General has no particular powers. It's the Security Council. And when you have the 5 permanent members with a veto, it's going to be stalled, as we've seen in Ukraine, for instance. Nothing has happened because of the Russian veto for 2 years. So the same now with Gaza. The Americans have vetoed 3 times. So it becomes complicated when there's not the international political will, when there's not consensus, when there's not unity in the Council to do something. However, on the humanitarian end, the UN is still effective. They're still logistically important. They're one of the only organizations that can get all of this aid over to Gaza. To get into Gaza, UNRWA is going in and distributing aid in difficult circumstances. You can't underestimate how difficult it is to deliver aid when there's live fire around you and no electricity, no communications. I mean, humanitarians have had to cancel convoys because they don't have cell phone ability to contact each other and to go on the roads and know if they're safe. So there's so many challenges, and I think that the UN is trying its best on the humanitarian front because that's really the only area where they can be effective right now.
Yeah, and the UN is having some difficulty about providing that humanitarian aid that people in Gaza really need, especially after that damning report came out as some humanitarian aid workers were involved in helping Hamas. That caused some countries to withdraw their aid to some of these humanitarian organizations. How is the UN coping with the realities now that it is operating with a shortage of aid funding, especially in a place like Gaza?
Well, I think the UN constantly operates with a shortage of aid funding in every emergency around the world. I mean, we hear it daily here. And this has been particularly challenging. The Secretary General and the head of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine, Philippe Lazzarini, they took immediate action when Israel came to them with this information about a dozen staffers who Israel presented them information with that they had been involved on October 7th with the attacks. There's apparently a dossier that has been leaked to the media, but the UN says they still have not received this dossier from the Israelis. They've only received sort of an oral briefing on it. But the Secretary General took immediate action, and the investigation is happening now into it. Keep in mind that UNRWA has around 13,000 employees in Gaza, and it's 12 who've been accused. So, in a huge organization, you sometimes have a few bad apples, but it's really badly damaged the UN's image. And the Israelis, the Israeli ambassador yesterday said basically the UN is part of Hamas and Hamas is part of the UN. So it's been very hard for their public image. And it endangers humanitarians when you put out, when these sorts of things happen, when they've been coming under constant criticism, yet they're working in really, really difficult conditions.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Really appreciate your reporting and analysis here on The World Today.
Thanks so much for having me.